night to everybody in TV land. This is Mike Hittner with Historic Point Basse Update. Today joining me on my left, Larry Knutson. Welcome, Larry.
Good morning.
And Don Matthews on my right.
Good morning. Welcome all.
And we're filming this on, taping it on August 19th, a Monday. So whenever you see this, we're out at our site, 3-bay shed here. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but first we're going to kind of review some of the events we've had in the past. July 27th, we had our Whodunit, written by Luke J. Conkle. It was called Sand Country. A great job he did on that. Larry was out at the cabin, and Don was the Sheriff Ray Falk, and I was Robert Wakely. And it turned out really nice. We didn't have what I would call a huge crowd, but we had a nice turnout. And what I think Don and I especially had talked about after the event is a lot of people that don't normally come to our events that are really interested in a mystery or something like that come out. So it's a different group of people that we don't normally get, and I guess that's what we're trying to entice here, is people come out to the site and they see and they kind of like one of our events and they come back for another event, and that's the name of the game. So it was a great day, a little warm, but not too bad. It was in the low 80s and a little bit of a breeze blowing, kind of warm for everybody, but we had about, I think Luke Conkle, who wrote it, afterwards counted the ballots for people who thought who did it, and I think Albert Turner did it, one of the young men that was in the play, played by Ryan Husted. And he counted 6 or 8, I believe, people that had guessed that, which out of probably the 50 or so people that were here, that 8 was a pretty good percentage that people had figured it out. I don't know where you were sending them, Larry. Where were you sending them? Did you have anybody you put the onus on that who might have done it or anything? Sometimes people ask you.
No, for the people that don't know, we do get a little detail ahead of time for our part, and then we find out what's the other parts are out there too. So you can do some speculation, but you don't want to lie about other things. So, you throw a little speculation on people and things like that. So I just kind of spread mine around, I think.
You were pretty democratic. You were spreading it around pretty good.
Yeah.
It was kind of interesting as for us characters, we were 3 of the characters and there was about 11 or 12 of us, that we really don't know who did it. So we can't really give it away because we don't know. I think that's kind of great for us because we'd always be worrying about slipping, giving too many clues or something like that. I kind of thought it was Albert Turner and his wife or something, so I kind of pushed him that way. Though I didn't know who it was, I happened to come out. Usually
I don't know. Luke did a very fine job this time. I think probably an exceptional script this year because as an actor, you could find a reason for just about every character he had that they could have possibly did it or they were involved in some kind of intrigue that made it happen. So it was really great for us. We had a lot of material to work with, and it was kind of fun in a sort of maybe a mischievous way. For me is I think 3 people left. There's 3 groups left saying, "Well, we're more confused now after we got talking to you than we were before." So
I think he did his part.
So that was sort of fun, and I think the reason, it's been an event that has been more and more popular every year, but it was just a tough weekend. They had the big state BMX races, and of course, a lot of people were still working on storm damage. And I think a lot of the people we saw were really from out of town more than anything. So I think it's an event that if you're looking for, at all interested in like murder mysteries and things like that, it's a very fun time.
We had I think a variety of people. We had a father and son. The son was probably in his 30s. We had a mother with 2 daughters that were like 10, 11 years old. We had whole families, and then we had individuals out here. So it's such a wide variety of people.
And the beauty of it is the cast is drawn from Historic Point Basse citizens, and we have community theater people. We have people from Wittenberg 4-H. I mean, it's drawn from all different groups of people. So and all the people that really do it really enjoy it, and they want to come back year after year. If I see them sometime between the middle of the year or something, they'll say, "Well, remember to give me a call." This year it was kind of nice because we had what I felt was more women's parts, which sometimes some years we only have 3 women, and Mary Wakely, maybe one of the Wakely daughters, and maybe the nurse or something like that. But this year we had about 5 women in it, which was kind of nice because they want to be involved too, and we want them to be involved. And so if we ask Luke, usually he'll write in some more women or something. This time it got the Turner family wrote into it, so we had 2 women from the Turner family. So yeah, it was a great success, and if you folks missed it, next year in the end of July, we haven't quite set the schedule, but in September we set the schedule for the following year, and so look forward to that. It'll be on our website probably say end of September. It'll be listing for 2020. And then we want to go on to the next event we have coming up here is our Harvest Fair. That is on September 14th from 10 to 4. It's a Saturday, and we invite you to come down. We're going to be doing the typical things you do during harvest. We're going to, well, hopefully most of the apples will be harvested, but we'll be making apple cider, and there's an apple cider press over by the ice house, and we'll take a look at that later. And also we'll be making kraut. The Giese family has done it since we began, and they're just aging out on it, and so yours truly will try his hand at kraut making. So I've seen enough of it, and I've done a little bit of it each year, so I think I've gotten. And Jim Giese, the principal that has been behind it the last 10 years, is going to buy the cabbage for us, and so we got enough for about 2 5-gallon pails. And of course, the beauty of that is both the apple cider and the kraut is the apple cider, if we got extra, we use it for our spirit walks, which come up in the last 2 Saturdays of October, and the kraut is used for our winter feast, which is in February. So that's kind of the beauty of it. In the house, I know the ladies are going to be doing some cooking, cranberry bread cookies, and what is the other name?
Abelskivers?
Abelskivers. There we go. Only a good Norwegian or Swede can say that sort of name, but Abelskivers. So they're going to be serving some food in there. They'll have crafters in there so you can take part in that. I know the schoolhouse always has events for the kids, things to do, fill out or to color, things like that. And so all the buildings will be open. Blacksmith will be here. The barn will be open. The 3-bay shed, of course, we do the pressing of the apples in the first bay over here to my right, which is also our ice bay where we keep the ice in, which we'll talk about a little later. But you have any projects in mind this year? You and Jim? You and Jim Nickel usually do the carpenter shop.
Well, I think in the past we've tried to do projects, and we do have a few projects. So if you're interested in getting some hands-on, just speak up. But typically, there's so many different varied tools and processes in the Sawyer area that we tend to just kind of try to perceive the interest of the person and go with that, and then expound on that, because we could talk for a day on this bay alone, and many of the projects we could sit you down and work with you a day on one part of it. So yeah. It's just something that is very time consuming if you want to do any of it, but you can get a cursory explanation of it and a little bit of history, or you can ask us to learn a little more, and maybe even, if you're old enough, you can even actually do some of these things.
Yeah, Larry, you got something going in the bunkhouse?
And we're not beyond learning ourselves. So if you have a relative out there that is a grandpa or great-grandpa or something that has done carpentry in the past and wants to come and give us some advice, I think we're always willing to take advice too.
Yeah.
So
nobody knows everything for sure.
Yeah. That brings us into a point with history in general. We're always looking for people to help us. The whole Wakely family and this site is still largely a mystery on what exactly happened, and even things in this time period is still shrouded in a lot of mystery, because just think of if someone had to go back in 100 years and find out exactly what we were doing, what kind of record would there be? I mean, you can really give credit to people that journal and write letters a lot and things like that, because especially in our digital age, I don't know just how much of a record we'll have of what we have done in this time. And it's not that much different from the 40s, 1860s. It's still very much, you have to look at a little bit, and you hate to assume, but you try to more than assume, you try to just extrapolate possibly what happened from a little bit of knowledge. So any more knowledge that we can gain is really beneficial.
Yeah, and if you have some of that information, surely bring it to our attention. We'd be interested in it, because what Don was saying is basically at the site we have very little information about the Wakeleys other than some censuses that were taken, so we know they raised some, in those days, milk cows, and they had so many personnel working in the inn and that sort of thing, and they had so many head of pigs and things like that, but we really don't know much. So what we have to do is take something from somewhere area that's similar in the same time frame and take that and put it in our context as what they would have probably done at the same time. That's about the only way we really can do it, is take a lateral movement from someplace like in Minnesota, and when we talk about the 3-bay shed, that's what this is coming from. But we have to kind of take that to find out what they would have done in a similar age in a similar rural setting like this.
And we may not. One of our main goals is to portray the Wakeley family and what they did here and stuff. But then we portray other things here as well that were in history during that time that may not pertain to the Wakeleys themselves, but somebody else in the community or whatever, a neighbor or whatever. They were doing that. So it's a living history museum where you have a hands-on experience, and so we try and have a broader spectrum on the whole property here as well.
And what you got with living history is it's living, it's changing.
Yeah.
It's nothing static all the time, because as we learn more and incorporate more into our presentations and our interpretation, it changes, because we've learned that now. Or somebody comes forward that maybe knew some relatives or somebody that lived in this area, well, they did that. We find out and then we incorporate it. If it's in our time period, that's what we do. So,
as an example, he asked what I'm going to be doing. Of course, I will be in the bunkhouse. I portray a Norwegian immigrant that came here to work in the lumber camps and buy property and bring my family over here. But you only work in the lumber camps during the winter, which I may explain a little more later in the 3-bay shed here. But I also then, for summer work, I hunt birds, and a lot of people back then hunted birds for a living, and one of the main birds was passenger pigeons. So if you want to know about passenger pigeons, come on down. I will tell you what I know, and I think we don't talk enough about it. It's actually a very important part of our history here in Wisconsin.
So September 14th, Harvest Fair, 10 to 4 at the Wakeley site. It's a Saturday. Come on down. $3 for adults, $1 for children. It's a good event, very inexpensive. Still, at this late date, even though that's this late in the year, a membership would be applicable, because we'll probably, if you come in this late, we'll give it to you for next year. So you'll have a membership for 2019 for the couple of 3 events we got going yet this year, and 2020 also. Usually when they come in after September, we give it to them for the next year too, because it doesn't hardly feel fair to cut them off right at that time.
And then to be really, obviously, but some people might not make the connection, is if you have a membership, you get into the events for free and your family. So that's what Mike's referring to.
Yeah, and I think Jim Nickel figured out, I think it was $70-some cheaper if you came to each of the events and didn't have to pay admission. I think for his family of 4 or something, I think he figured it on, and was like saving of $70 over paying it out each time individually. Our next event after Harvest Fair, we just want to mention it because it's kind of it's a workshop. It's a campfire cooking workshop, and that's on September 21st from 9 to 4, and that happens right here at the site. And maybe I'll let Larry explain a little bit more. He's been a part of it. He does fire starting and a few other things for that event. And Larry, you want to explain a little more what it's about?
Well, it's learning how to cook with cast iron over a campfire, pit cooking, and then how to cook in the wood stove in the house. So a lot of cast iron cooking, a lot of people are kind of afraid of it, and it's not something to be afraid of. It's something to be appreciated for sure, because it's wonderful food. But we have, I don't remember right offhand, we have probably 7 different types of cooking with cast iron out there. I do the learning how to, if you want to learn how to start fire with flint and steel, to start your fires, but we have cooking in a pit. We have cooking above ground, all kinds of different things. I'm not sure what our menu is this year. You come in and you help do some of the preparation. You do a little bit of the cooking, and then you also get to eat. So we have, believe me, you will not go away hungry after this event, and it's an excellent event.
You remember what the cost was at $15?
I believe it was $15, and what that does is we're really not making any money on that. That is to pay for the grocery items, you know, to make all the food. And I want people to be aware, we are limited on the number of people that we can have attend this event, because otherwise, you know, we need to know ahead of time as well. Right now we're saying 15 people is our limit. We have gone over that, you know, but we can't go too far over that, just simply because we wouldn't have enough food and things like that.
So that's a campfire cooking workshop on September 21st. That's a Saturday, a week after the Harvest Fair, from 9 to 4. And so if you want to check our website out, you can sign up. I think there's maybe 6 or 8 signed up already, and then this will add to that. But like Larry says, there's a limit at a certain point that we can handle. So with the food, the $15, like Larry says, covers the food. The cattails are expensive this year, and no, there's other food too, but they cook some wild foods
and
too.
a drink as well.
Yeah.
Some teas, sumac tea and things like that. So it's I've had people come to this that were just amazed.
Well, and the beauty of it is that Larry speaks to it well from his own endeavors in his own work. He came to one and he's come back to help with it, and that's true of a lot of people that are involved in it.
Anything with good food, I'm there.
So thank you, folks, and now we're going to go in and talk about the 3-bay shed. Okay, we're going to talk about the 3-bay shed. This is a building at the Wakely site, probably one of the most important buildings. Actually, 3rd building built here. I mean, the house was here and the school was moved in, but I think the first built building we did was a 3-bay shed. Rob Nury was involved at that time, and he was really active and wanted to get a shed here because we had a lot of things to store. You can imagine nowadays we've got a pole building for storage and everything, and we got a chicken coop just over to my right here. But in those days we had nothing to store here. Everything we had was in here. So this 3-bay shed is modeled after one from the Oliver Kelly farm in Minnesota. Oliver Kelly was a early pioneer, and he promoted the Grange movement. It's a farm movement that I think exists yet to this day. It's not as big as it was years ago, but it was a rural farm movement. And he was
co-op, right?
Yes,
Co-op.
and he was involved in it, and on his site, and Don has seen it, I've been there, and when we had saw it on his site, Rob had the idea of building. It was a building. His 3-bay shed was from the 1850s, mostly stores farm machinery, if I remember right from being over there, but ours is used a little differently. It's a little history on it. The 3rd building on our site. Consolidated at the time that we built this was going and getting Voigt company from Germany was building all the paper machines. So they sent all this rough cut lumber to the United States. All their machinery was packed in rough cut lumber. Well,
somebody had found out that they had a boneyard, a place where they had deposited a bunch of this, and they said we could go out there like 2 Saturdays and claim whatever we wanted. So this building is mostly built out of reclaimed lumber from Voight companies sending their paper machines to Consolidated in those days. So once in a while you'll see something sprayed on the side of it. It says Voight Company or some dimensions or something, but that's basically where it all came from. So it was a good recycling. The rest of it came from Walker Cranberry Company. They took a shed down, and Rob happened to be in contact with him, and so the bigger post and beams and everything like that came from a shed that was on the Walker Cranberry Company. So we decided early on, and Rob was still involved at that time, we were going to do ice harvest. So the ice harvest was a thing that we did on a pond at first, and then we did it at the Cranberry Marsh across County Trunk Z from the Wakely site here. And then we finally started getting connected with the Port Edwards Lions, and they do a fishery in January. So we cut ice in January and we bring it to the site. And I'll take you right over to the ice house, and these gentlemen will tell you about their specific areas of interest here too. So this is the ice house here. You can see the ice house behind me. We have just a little bit of ice left in this. We're taping this on August 19th, and we were taking sawdust out last week on the 12th, and we got down to the bottom layer of ice, and there was actually full blocks down there. So we covered it back up, and we're saving that hopefully for our harvest fair. We'll drag some ice out so you can take a look at it. You can see ice was a big part of our history in North America, especially out east where they shipped ice. We got some pictures of our ice harvest. This is out at the Port Edwards Lions Fishery on Nepco Lake. And you can see some of us harvesting ice there. But this is something that has been going on, in fact, was probably the second or third biggest export from the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And these are just some photos. There was actually a stamp. Robert Fawcett stamp made was showing them cutting with the ice with the old ice hand saws. Then there's a couple more diagrams of some, you can see some ice houses, they were very commercial. They had 3 or 4 warehouses where they stored the ice. They even had a conveyors type of system to take it up to that. And they used horses and ice plows and everything like that. But let me take you inside and show you some of the equipment here. We got ice saws in here. These are the big cutting saws, and of course, you know, the beauty of this is we always look for somebody to help us, but the problem is we can't get another man on the other end because there's no handle, and plus they'd have to hold their breath a lot. But you can see the size compared to a wood saw. You can see the size and the thickness of this. This is very thick compared to a wood saw because they're cutting ice, and it's a lot harder. And you can see there's a kerf on these where about every other one is curved a little bit, so it cuts more. Our first few years we didn't know about putting the kerf on it, so what we had to do is we had to cut by friction, which took a lot of time and a lot of effort. And these saws are probably about 25-30 pounds, but of course you don't lift them much. And then we have 3 smaller saws, and these are called trim saws. Now when you get a block of ice up on the top of the other ice, you can cut a block and cut it into smaller pieces, easier to handle. So this is just a small, and you all have metal handles, of course, pretty much, because the tendency is they'll break otherwise. And then they got like a spud here. It's once you cut a little bit into the ice, if it isn't too thick, you can break that and you don't have to cut all the way through the ice. So this is a kind of called a spud that just breaks that ice loose. And then we got covered here with sawdust, of course, since we were taking sawdust out. And this is an ice plow. This is a steel plow that is horse-drawn, and you'd stand back here and hold this just like you would a plow. The handle's back here, and you have a horse in front, and what you do is you score the ice, and then if the ice isn't really thick, say if it's 12 inches or less, you can break it then with the spud. This scores it. It can go down probably 4 or 5 inches deep by scoring it, but horse-drawn. We haven't used it. We just show it because we really don't have a horse that will go on the ice, and the problem with that is a possibility that the horse could fall or something like that and could break a leg or something like that. So you can see we got tongs of different sizes to pick up the ice. You have to pick it up and lift it a little bit, and we got smaller tongs or bigger tongs depending on what we're doing with it. And then in the ice house, we pile it up about 2.5 feet from the top of the ceiling, and it's packed with sawdust about 20 inches around all the sides, sawdust in between the layers of ice, and then about 2 feet of sawdust on top of it. And you can see we got a little bit of sawdust in there, but we only got one layer of ice left. We had probably about 7 layers of ice, about 40 to 50 blocks, about 60 to 100 pounds per block, depending on how thick the ice is. I think this last year was around 14 inches. Some years it's 18 inches. Some years only 12 inches. We do use block and tackle for some of it if it's harder to raise up, but we bring it in here from Nepco Lake with a pickup truck. We have to qualify that because we just don't have a horse drawn. As long as we're in here, we talked about in our harvest fair pressing apples. This is a hand press that you put the apples in here. They go from the chute into there, and you turn it. This chews up the apples, and then you put it in the press, and that presses the apple juice out, comes out through this little opening. We put a pitcher down here to catch it, and we filter it. But this is the apple press that we use on the site. Not unlike, this is a more modern version of it, but they basically have been building the apple presses like this for probably the last 100 years. So it's not something that's extremely old, but it's something that they've been using for a long, long time, similar to it. And it's stored right next to the ice house when it's not in use during the year. And the apple press, we use the apple cider to people to sample during the harvest fair, and we also use it if we got extra for the spirit walk.
Anytime.
Welcome to our Sawyer's shop, and as the name you'd assume, it's all about sawing wood. And just a little bit of history about Sawyers. Sawyers are changing in our time period. And of course, our time period is 1840 to 1860. And the reason it's changing is because you're starting to see wood sawed mechanically with either a large circular saw in a mill or a vertical saw. And if you ever want to see a great example of that, go to the Wade House, and they have a recreation of a historic sawmill, a vertical sawmill. Very, very interesting. It's over by Elkhart Lake, and it was a very great experience. The whole site is really great, and it has a great carriage house, so it's something I would recommend going to see. But especially pertains to our trade, because the Sawyer is changing, because until this time you can go all the way back into some pictures from the ancient Egyptians where they had 2 people on just a saw with some teeth on it, and they would saw the log. And basically it was all hand sawed until pretty much the 1800s when it started to be mechanized. So then that's when the Sawyer's trade started to change. And in a community like this, the Sawyer, I like to use the analogy that the Sawyer is like a combination carpenter and lumberman. And you don't want to get confused with the joiner, because the joiner is, because I still am a member of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America. And the joiner part of it is the cabinet maker and the furniture maker and that's what a furniture maker, cabinet maker in this day and age would have been called in the 1840s, is a joiner, not a carpenter. So you had, the terminology was changing. A lot of things were changing as history in this time. It was a very active, changeable time in history. So a Sawyer would make his living by
by doing anything in the settlement, making firewood, selling shavings for starting fires, actually being a agent for buying sawed lumber. But the problem with sawed lumber is you had to go earn some money and pay money for sawed lumber. So these people would shy away from that because it was basically a barter economy. So what they would like to do when they had to make some furniture, of course, the sawyer wasn't the only one that made firewood. We make firewood mainly for people that had other activities, and we could barter with them. And I bartered a lot with the blacksmith for tools versus lumber and wood. And what they would do when they would go out and search for firewood is when they saw a wood that was like nice straight grain like this, they would say, well, let's just put that to the side, and when we get time, we'll take our froe, this is a froe, and our mallet, and we'll split it in a controlled manner. That's what allowed, and most people remember, or if they know anything about a froe, they think the froe was always used for making shingles, but it was used for other things too, and you could make lumber with it. Now here I'm going to make a piece of like 1-inch lumber, and I'm going to just, it was always somewhat of a gamble, but basically if it didn't work out, you're still left with firewood. So you start it off like that, and then if you're successful, this should split into a piece of wood that you can plane. And the froe was used like this, so it had this handle on it, so you could work it down. See? Now this one is not turning out well. So this is an example of something that just doesn't work out that well. See, because it's going down, it's just not working. See, it's getting thinner. But here's an example of one that really worked well. This was actually split with a froe. And this is an example of how this was also split too, and it was cleaned up, because I'm going to actually use these pieces to make more of an English version of a shaving horse. And so you can see you could make a rough table or a rough bench out of things like that instead of having to go buy lumber. Now this is called a shaving horse, and this is a draw knife, and a lot of things were made this way. A lot of people like to call this a Schnitzelbank just because it's a German name, basically just because Schnitzelbank is such a cool name, but anyway, in German that means a sitting vise. But the beauty of this is the wood is held by friction on a foot pedal below, so you can start shaping your wood, and then if you want to reposition it just that quick, you can reposition that wood. So it's what this allows you to do is reposition quickly, and it's just very versatile. Now, but this version is more of a European version. They also make, like I was explaining before, more of an English version where you have two arms coming down like this. And then of course you can visualize this. You have these two arms coming across and coming up, and then a bar across, so you can get quite a larger log in there and work on that. Plus you can put another support underneath there, so you can work with smaller wood or larger wood. So it's very versatile. And another thing that the sawyer would make rough furniture. Now this is an example of a bench that he might make. He might have split a log or even sawed it. I mean, he still did do some sawing. It was still very labor intensive, and they might go back to the old ways for a little while. In this day and age, you still could find some saw pits, basically where you had a big log and you had a man below and a man above. I just recently got done reading a book on early Australia and called Fatal Shores, and it also talked a lot about the English history. And at that time, that was in right around the 1790s, 1800, and they talked about the life in England. And one thing that was brought up in there was the life of a sawyer. And apparently there was a kind of a pecking order where some people would be on top of the pit operating the saw, and some people would be underneath. And of course, all the sawdust would be falling on this person. And it said in there that within 2 years, the man below would go blind. So it was a very, very hazardous industry to be in at that time. It was just like the hatters with the mercury and the tanning. It was a very toxic environment that they had to work in. But so it wasn't something that that people would like to do, but if they really had to do it, they would do it. Another thing that started happening was mechanization. Now, when I made a bench similar to this, I went on the shaving horse and carved it and drilled a hole. Of course, you still use the old drill. Basically, you use a hand drill and drill this hole in, and then you size your leg a little bit bigger than the hole, and then you go on the snip, and you saw around this area, and then you slowly carve this into the same diameter as this hole in there. Probably, I think the first time I did this, it took me like 3 hours to do one leg. And it was a very slow process because you have to keep on using calipers and being careful not to go too small, because then you got to start over. But in that same era, they started to develop some tools that was really a labor-saving device, and it all revolved around the brace. I think everyone really understands that the brace, and this is a little bit more modern one. It was about that time period, but probably in the newer version in our time period. I mean, it goes way back into very antique braces. So braces have been around for probably as long as the history of carpentry and cabinet making. But what you would do is get your wood size down to where this, like a pencil sharpener, could make a cone shape on the end, and then that would allow this leg cutter to get a start, and so it would be centered. And as you would drill, as you would put it in a vise and turn it, it would make this leg, and you'd probably have, instead of 3-4 hours in doing this, you could probably do this in 20 minutes. So mechanization was already starting in our time period. So, and a lot of times we like to portray that. And we also are starting to get into coopering, and hopefully in the next few years we can demonstrate more in the coopering part of things when you come. And of course we have a great selection of planes. Sometimes if you ask us, we can demonstrate these planes for you. We have some of the old-time drills for the timber making. We can demonstrate the azes. It's just I would like to just really stress that it's up to you how you experience this area of our site, and just don't be afraid to ask questions, and like they said, share your knowledge also. So thank you.
Okay, this is the third bay of the 3-bay shed, and this is what I like to call our logging and lumbering bay of the shed. We have a lot of different items in here that were actually used during the logging eras in Wisconsin, where they would go to the lumber camps during the wintertime and cut the big, huge white pines down. There are three main reasons that they harvested the white pines during the winter. One is because these white pine were so huge, in order to get them from the woods down to the streams to be floated to the lumber mills in the spring, they had to build ice roads in the woods. So they would actually haul water through the woods and build roads of ice to haul those logs down. The second reason is during the winter time, the white pine sap is driven down into the roots. So when you cut the white pine tree off, all that sap is not in the white pine up above, and therefore you get a nice dry lumber that doesn't have a lot of weeping sap in it. Third reason is during that period, it's a time when the men that worked in the lumber camps could leave their farms and their families and go to the lumber camps to harvest that pine. So they would be in the lumber camps harvesting pine during the 1830s, 1840s, and so on. In the lumber camps, they typically used exclusively oxen. They did not use horses. Horses they used at a later point. And this is an example of an ox shoe. They actually had to shoe the oxen. Now this is a half of a shoe because, of course, with a split hoof, they would have the other half over here. And they needed these shoes because they had cleats in order to walk on those ice roads that they built. So they would have the shod oxen to pull those huge logs down. When they cut trees in the 1840s, they typically used axes to cut the trees. They did use what we know as the crosscut saw at later dates, because when the rake was invented on the saw, that's when they could easily cut through to make a cross-cut saw on there. When they later era, about the 1880s or maybe even into the 1860s, if they used a cross-cut saw to cut a tree, you needed what's called a sawyer's wedge, or what I call a sawyer's wedge, or a lumberman's wedge. The men that cut the lumber each one would carry one of these, and a very personal item. It's a smaller wedge, and it always has a hole in it. And if you find one of these, they're very, very hard to find. But it's a lumberman's wedge. It's got a hole in it, and the reason for that is when you would cut into a tree on the back cut, you would put this behind your saw. And as you got closer to it, you would pound this in. And this, if the wind blew, it kept from pinching your saw as you were sawing the tree. Also, where you place this wedge in that tree helped direct the fall of that log. So therefore they use these. The reason they're so hard to find today is once the chainsaw was invented, these were no longer usable, because if a chainsaw came back and hit this, it would ruin your chain. So they got discarded, lost. They were small, not many alternative uses, so they're extremely hard to find today. But it's a smaller wedge again. Always have that hole, because that hole was put in there because they would have a rope or strap or something from that hole tied to their belt, so that, or their bibs or whatever, so that when they were sawing and that tree started to go, all they had to do was back up and that wedge would pop out. Remember, they're sawing during the winter, so during the winter there's snow on the ground, and if this fell on the ground, all you have to do is take that strap or that rope and you pull up your wedge. You didn't have to go digging in the snow for it. That's the reason for the hole. So that's just a couple items that we have. When the people are in the lumber camp and it's time to quit for the day, they stayed out there all day. The meals were actually taken out to them as they were cutting in the woods and things, but when it was time to quit at the end of the day, they may have a horn such as this. A horn like this would be for multiple uses, and they would blow this horn, and that meant you were done for the day. You could come in and probably have a nice hearty supper for them. I believe this could be used when you're rafting logs as well, to give warning or letting people know that you're coming or whatever. So I think I don't know for sure, but I'm sure that horn had multiple uses. One thing is when they cut the lumber, or cut the trees into lumber, they made huge rafts at the lumber mills. And most of the lumber mills were north of here, north of Point Basse. And when they were cutting the lumber, they would put them into rafts of lumber. And they were made smaller rafts. They were called rapids rafts because they had to run those rafts down through the rapids. And when they run them down through the rapids, they would come down to Point Basse. Once they got to this location, they would then gather those smaller ones and make one huge Wisconsin River raft, which then they would float down to Missouri and so on to sell that lumber. The men that rode those rafts, they would actually be riding the rafts, and even the men taking the lumber, the logs to the lumber mills would ride the logs down there. They had caulk boots, they're called, or boots with spikes on. One item they would have would be this pike. It's a very, very long pike. It's got a pointy end on it, so they could push that lumber, they could push those logs, they could grab with the other hook there, and they could hook that log and keep them from, so they didn't build up in the rivers and the rapids and stuff and make a log jam, because if you had a log jam, that was probably one of the most dangerous things that you could have on the river. Many, many, many men, including one of the Wakely boys, died on the river running a raft, log raft. Don in the second bay there showed a lot of things for carpentry, things you would have for carpentry. But for the common man out there, a lot of carpentry they didn't use, but they did use the wood. And one thing they made out of the wood were beams. They would make big beams for barns, building whatever buildings they would have. And in order to make those beams and make some of the lumber, they would use tools something like this. And they would take a tool like this to square off that beam. And these would be extremely sharp. Excuse me. And you would take this and you would chip away at that, and you would chip all the way down the log. And if you go to some of the barns in the area, the older barns and things, you'll see logs that are actually chipped. And they're huge logs like this, so it took a lot of work. But the secret to a tool like this is you let the tool do the work. You do not take a lot of effort in chipping away at that log. You let the weight of the tool do the work. This is one type of adze that they would use for that. For some of the bigger beams, they may use a broad axe like that. And I don't know if you can see this, but that axe is offset. And the reason it's offset is so that you can go down the edge of that log to take off that very fine layer, if you wish, on there. For bigger beams and things like that, you may want to stand up, so you'd use something with a longer handle. Having all these tools are very nice, but the main thing you have to have is you have to have them sharp. And what they would do, they would use a whetstone like this. It's called a whetstone because you want to keep it wet. The trough down here, you would have water in there. In that water, you would have somebody turn this stone. And a man that knew what they were doing would take a tool like this, and somebody would be turning that, and then he would run this over the stone. And if you have a man that really knows what he's doing on whetstone, a tool like this with this whetstone, he can get that sharp enough to shave with. So it really takes a lot of experience. One of the other things that they had when they would bring logs down the river to the lumber mills, excuse me, there are different logging companies upriver. And what they needed to do was they needed to mark their logs, so when they got to the lumber mills and they were gathered up, they knew whose log was whose. So they actually had a stamp that they would stamp in the end of the logs. And here are some examples of PM Wausau papers. Alexander Stewart was a heart-shaped stamp, and they would stamp that in the logs. Some of the log rafts they had and some of the lumber rafts they'd have, they need to anchor them when they would get down to logging mills. When the water is low on the Wisconsin River, you can see huge rock piles out in the river by where some of the lumber mills used to be. And those rock piles were actually anchors, where they would anchor these huge rafts of logs. And I don't know if you can see this, but there is a chain down here, and this chain is humongous. And that would be a chain that they would use to chain those log rafts down. And if you see the size of that chain, you can use your imagination to imagine just how huge those log rafts would be down there. So that is our third bay of the 3-bay shed, and that's our logging history. We have a log here that was cut out, and we do have the history of the log of the Wakeleys marked out on that log for your enjoyment. So if you come to see our 3-bay shed at Harvest Fest this year, you're lucky enough, you can actually go away with wood chips from the actual 3-bay shed that have carved in our shed for your souvenir, free of charge. Thank you.